usually
It's
only.
weird because the discussion happens before the second one.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's because we are not going to be here on Thursday.
I mean, most of the
So
people that
that's
tell
taking
me
the place of
are
class on
because
Thursday.
they didn't show up.
Otherwise, it would be due later in the day.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be focusing in on absolutism. Now, last time we talked about how the English developed a constitutional monarchy, and this was something that it didn't happen overnight. It wasn't something that happened smoothly. It wasn't a smooth operation, a smooth process. There were a lot of fits and starts and conflicts. You know, we looked at the English Civil War. We looked at the Glorious Revolution, and today we're going to finish looking at the British constitutional system, and then we're going to look at France. Now, France, we already talked about how Spain under Philip II kind of was a forerunner of an absolutist state with a strong monarchy, with a development of a large, complex bureaucracy. Well, that became what France developed into, and France would emerge as the predominant power in Europe in the 17th century, especially during the reign of Louis XIV. Many kings of Europe had a kind of a hate-love relationship with Louis XIV, in the sense that they hated him because they envied France's great power and success, but they loved him, wanted to be like him. They wanted to have that kind of a state for their own, and so his kind of government that he set up served as a model for what other European monarchs wanted to do, maybe not on the same grand scale, but that's what they wanted to do. He was their aspiration. So he was a very influential monarch in shaping the history of the 17th century, but also somebody who was a model for other rulers in Europe, all the way through to the end of the early modern era in the 18th century. All right, so that's what we're going to cover today. So let's finish up England first. When we last left England, William and Mary, at the invitation of Parliament, had come over and been recognized as the King and Queen of England, Mary being the eldest daughter of James II, the king who was deposed by Parliament, sent packing, and William of Orange, the stadtholder, he was of the House of Orange, a descendant of William the Silent. He became King of England. Now, he was interested in Dutch affairs. One of the reasons why he took on the job and accepted the throne of England was because he wanted to bring England into a grand alliance against his number one enemy, Louis XIV. William of Orange and Louis XIV were like Voldemort and Harry Potter. if you follow that series, they were like the two sides who just were always in competition with each other. So William of Orange, his interests were primarily in affairs of the time, and so that meant that he was willing to allow Parliament to do whatever it wanted. So Parliament had the opportunity to really push and exercise its authority. One of the first things that Parliament did was it drafted the English Bill of Rights in 1689. And yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me put the forms up there. Here you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Here we go. Should work.
Oh, yeah.
Well, not working now. There we go. All right. Now you see it?
Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that. So he signed the English Bill of Rights in 1689, and the English Bill of Rights, if you have a chance to read it, should be very familiar to you if you know your American history, because many of the rights guaranteed to all Englishmen by the English Bill of Rights were the same rights guaranteed to all Americans by the American Bill of Rights, drafted 100 years later in 1789, like the right to a trial by jury, the right to property, the right to not be subject to cruel and unusual punishment, not to have the billeting of soldiers, which is, that's really comes under the right to property, but but so many, the idea of having a list of a written list of what the rights of citizens are actually was, the model was established by the English when Parliament wanted to say these are the rights of Englishmen, and all kings from all governments from this point onward have to respect these rights as belonging to all Englishmen. So that was a very important moment in history, and it very much shaped our own history as Americans. Another thing that Parliament did was that, very important in the history of the period, was 1690 they passed the Toleration Act. There have been a lot of problems when James II in 1687 had granted toleration to all religions. But the problem in 1687 was that it had been done by executive order, by the order of the king. The Toleration Act was passed by Parliament and signed into law because members of Parliament, the ruling class in England, really did come to believe that trying to enforce a single religion for all subjects was too much of a hassle, too much of a problem, created too much disturbances. So what the Toleration Act was it guaranteed freedom of religion in England. Now, it's important to remember, though, this is in the English system, that there still was an established church, the Church of England. And if you wanted to run for office or hold any kind of government job, you still had to be a member in good standing of the Church of England. Dissenters, as they became known, people who practiced other religions other than the Church of England, they were, under the Toleration Act, they were allowed to practice the religion. They weren't required to pay the tithe, the 10% of their income, to the church, but they couldn't hold office, ever. And they couldn't even be accepted into Oxford or Cambridge, the two major universities. So they were allowed to have, their religion was tolerated, but they still weren't considered, in effect, second-class citizens for choosing to be dissenters rather than belong to the established church. But it was still an important milestone in establishing the freedom of religion. And you can look forward to the 1689 American Bill of Rights. One of the most important rights, First Amendment, includes freedom of religion. There should be no establishment of religion. That was put forward into the American Bill of Rights 99 years after the Toleration Act was passed in 1690. You also, in 1694, Parliament passed the Triennial Act. Now, what the Triennial Act did was it guaranteed that there would always be a Parliament. Under the Triennial Act, if 3 years went by and there was no election, there was an automatic election. So you remember the king, previously the king could call for an election at his discretion, or her discretion if it was a queen. But under the Triennial Act, even if there was not a call for election, there would be an election every 3 years regardless. And now, you have to remember that William of Orange, he was willing to sign into law and give away these powers and grant authority to Parliament because all he wanted from Parliament was more money to fight his war against Louis XIV. So he really was willing to give whatever he had to give away whatever he had to give away to get that money to fight his wars on the continent. Now, it turned out that there would be a continuation of weak monarchs. Now, William of Orange was not weak; he just didn't care about it. Now, what happened is that Mary died, and so did William, and they had no children. William and Mary had a childless marriage. So, as a result, the throne passed to Mary's younger sister, known as Queen Anne. Now, Queen Anne, there's her picture here. She was a very nice lady, by all accounts, but she really had no interest in government. She was married to a Danish prince. He was the Prince of Denmark. He didn't care about being involved in the government. So under Queen Anne's reign, basically, the way it worked was that whatever members of Parliament had the biggest influence and the biggest impact among other members of Parliament, they were the ones asked to form a government and to be the government of England. So basically under Queen Anne, it would be powerful members of Parliament who were forming the executive branch and making the decisions, because the king and the queen, in this case Queen Anne, really didn't really have a particular interest in the day-to-day operation of the government. Now, one of the most powerful men in England in the time of Queen Anne was a member of Parliament and an aristocrat named John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. He was the a direct descendant of the future Winston Churchill, the great Prime Minister of England. He was the commander of British forces in the field, and by all accounts, he was the chief executive at this time period. Now, one of the reasons why he was so influential, of course, was because his wife was one of the best friends of the Queen of England, so that kind of helps to have a wife who's the best friend of the Queen of England. But under the system, you can see a system developing where members of Parliament are the ones who are making the decisions and running the government, not the monarch. Now Queen Anne and her husband had no children, so now the throne, by succession, should have gone to little Jimmy Stewart, the son of James II, who now had grown up to be a man. But he was Roman Catholic, and he was of the house of, the son of James II. Parliament did not want him to be king. So what they did is Parliament went and they found the nearest relative other than James, and it was the Elector of Hanover, a German prince named George of Hanover. And he was actually a great-grandson of James I. And he was a German. He was born and raised in Germany, could barely even speak English. But he was the closest relative other than little Jimmy Stewart. So they decided, the Parliament decided to ask George I to come and be the King of England. And he accepted the offer. And he became George I, King of England. And he started the House of Hanover. And now the thing about George I was that he continued to be the Elector of Hanover, a German duchy. And he could care less about England. He didn't even like going there. And it was true of his son. His son George II was the exact same way. So for the next 50 years, all the way up until 1760, in England you had two kings who spoke German, could care less about England, and so basically under these two kings, what they would do is the same thing Queen Anne did. They would find out who were the most powerful, influential members of Parliament and ask them to form a government. In fact, under the reign of George I, the minister asked to form a government by the king, who had the most influence in Parliament, became known as the Prime Minister. You ever heard that phrase, Prime Minister? So that they'd have an election, and whatever member of Parliament had the most influence among the members of Parliament, that person would be asked to form a government, and that person would be called the Prime Minister. And so basically the Parliament was taking on executive authority because there was a vacuum created by the fact that the monarchs of England really didn't have an interest in actually being chief executives. Now it's important to remember that not everybody was happy with this Hanoverian succession. In fact, up in Scotland, in the Highlands of Scotland, for example, the Scottish clans all rallied behind James, believed to be James III, and it was called the Jacobite Rising, and they had to go in there and crush this uprising. The English did. It was brutally suppressed, and there was a lot of bloodshed. In fact, this is an interesting story. I didn't realize this till I heard about this in a talk, that the English government banned the wearing of kilts after the Jacobite uprising, because all the clans, each of the clans had a particular way of weaving their kilt, and so they wanted to weaken the power and influence of these clans in the Highlands, so they banished the wearing of kilts after the Jacobite uprising in 1715. Now, so you can see that by the 18th century, basically Parliament was in charge. And the Parliament is not one man, or it's a bunch of men. So you had a lot of members of Parliament. And so whenever you have a bunch of people trying to run something, you're always going to be divided into factions. And it wasn't long in the 18th century before the English Parliament was divided into political parties or factions. And they became known as the Whigs and the Tories. Now, what originally divided the members of Parliament was the issue of succession. Like, Whigs supported the Hanoverian succession, and Tories initially were those who believed that the throne ought to belong to the Stuart family. And that was what originally divided up the Parliament. But eventually, over time, that difference kind of faded away and other political differences arose. Traditionally, over the course of the 18th century, the Whigs came to represent a political ideology that believed that power corrupts, and too much power corrupts too much. So the idea would be that under the Whig political view was that Parliament ought to just share powers, that you ought not to have power concentrated in the hands of too few people. And so they wanted to see power at the local level, and they wanted to see a Parliament where you had shared responsibility. Tories, on the other hand, became associated with a philosophy where you needed to have more centralized state, where you needed to have more decision-making and power in the hands of the king's immediate ministers. And they also had some cultural differences. Whigs tend to be what was called low church. They tend to be more Protestant in their outlook. They wanted a church that was more Calvinist, whereas Tories tended to be more high church, more Catholic than Whigs. So over time, these political parties in Parliament developed different outlooks and cultural views, very similar to the way that Democrats and Republicans today have different views about government and different cultural supporters. And so here again we see that England influenced America. In fact, in the mid-19th century, there was actually a political party in America called the Whig Party. So once again, we see that politics in England really came to influence and shape the American political system, which is not surprising given the fact that the 13 colonies were originally British colonies. All right, so let's go, and now we're going to talk about France here. And now France also developed a political system in the 17th century, quite different than England, and it's called absolutism. Now, in your readings I assigned you, you can read all about absolutism, so I'm not going to go into a lot of the ideology of absolutism, but I want to discuss how it happened. And one thing that's important to remember, like absolutism developed in fits and starts and through struggle, just like constitutional monarchy developed in England. It wasn't a smooth process. It wasn't some kind of pre-planned operation. There was a lot of chance involved and struggle. Now, when we last left France, Henry IV started a new dynasty, the Bourbon dynasty. And remember, he was the one who issued the Edict of Nantes that allowed toleration for Huguenots. And he is credited with being a good stabilizing force. He ended the wars of religion, and he gave peace to France and gave France time to heal after years and years of religious conflict. But one of the things he did was that he began the process of kind of rebuilding or creating a strong centralized state. At this particular time in France, France was divided up into a lot of different provinces, and every region of France had its own local parliament. That's how you spell it in French. Now, the parliament was organized very similar to the estates that we saw in the Netherlands. Every parliament represented the members of the church, the Roman Catholic Church in France, the landowning aristocracy, and then wealthy commoners, primarily merchants living in the towns. So every region of France had its own parliament. And they had developed in the Middle Ages, and just like the Cortes in Spain or the Estates General or the English Parliament, no taxes could be imposed without the approval of the local parliament. Now, what Henry IV did, he was a very good diplomat, very charismatic man. He went to every one of these parliaments and he asked for tax money. He asked them to raise taxes for the government. And once he had that money, he began to really save it. Now, it turns out that he had a financial genius as his right-hand man. His name was the Duc de Sully. Now, Duc de Sully was actually a French Huguenot, but he was promoted, and he was like the right-hand man of the king, and he was a financial wizard. And so over the course of Henry IV's reign, what happened was that France became more stable. They had more of the central government had a stable source of revenue through all these new tax dollars, and they had a government official who was making sure that that money was well spent. Another thing that Henry IV did was that he began to go through and make sure that at the local level, he got his own men, his own people, in charge of running local affairs. So he's trying to create a more centralized state. Now, Henry IV, though, still in his prime, he was middle-aged, he was a fairly young man, he was assassinated. You know, some of the more rabid Roman Catholics still remembered him as the enemy. And he was killed, he was assassinated in 1610 by a Catholic assassin. So he died in 1610. Now, this created a crisis. Remember I said that absolutism is a story of, its development is a story of strife and chance and struggle. What happened when he died, I wanted to mention one thing. If you know it for your Canadian history, if you like Canadian history, one of the things that's significant about Henry IV's reign was that he was interested in establishing colonies, and the French colony of Quebec was founded by Samuel Champlain, a French explorer and an investor who established the first French colony, permanent French colony in the New World at Quebec. So that's why they still speak French in Quebec and in Canada. But anyway, now when Henry IV died, when he was assassinated, you had a situation where his son was just a boy. Louis XIII in 1610 was barely a teenager, and so his mother, Maria de' Medici, another Medici, Maria de' Medici, she was an Italian, and she was now the regent. So once again you had a situation where you had a foreigner and a woman serving as the regent in France. And it was at this particular point that some of the nobility saw an opportunity to really promote themselves. Now, you've got to remember that some French aristocrats still had their own castles, they had their own private armies, and after 1610, all these French aristocrats with their armies marched on Paris and demanded privileges and exemptions from taxes and all kinds of liberties from the queen, thinking that, she's a queen, we can bully her. Well, what Marie de' Medici did was that she called in a meeting of the Estates General. And the Estates General would be when all the different estates from all over France came to convene in Paris. And so it included representatives from the aristocracy, from the nobility, and from the townspeople, from the merchants, from the common people. They all met in 1613 at this Estates General meeting, and when they all got together, nobody could agree on anything, because the commoners, the wealthy townspeople, distrusted the nobility, and vice versa. So the Estates General really accomplished nothing. And on top of that, what Maria de' Medici did was she gave the aristocrats everything they wanted. Basically, she said, you want more land, you can have it. You want tax exemptions, you want it. You want high offices in the government, you got it. So once the aristocrats got what they wanted, they weren't interested in the Estates General. They all went home. So the Estates General disbanded, really accomplishing nothing. Once the aristocrats, the powerful landowning aristocrats, got what they wanted. Now after that, Maria de' Medici, though, operated more subtly. Now it turned out that she, over the course of years, she found a right-hand man to do the job of running France, and his name was Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu was a Frenchman who originally was the priest, the Roman Catholic priest to the Queen. So initially, when the Queen had Mass, when she celebrated church, Richelieu was the guy who was the priest. Now he became the confidant and the friend of the Queen, and eventually he took on the job of doing the day-to-day job of running France. And later on, he was elevated to the title of cardinal, one of the princes of the Catholic Church. That's how his name wasn't cardinal; that was a title. But it's known to history as Cardinal Richelieu. And for about 18 years, he was the governor of France. And one title historians often bestow on Cardinal Richelieu is the architect of absolutism. He created a system in France that would be what Louis XIV would inherit and build on. So who was Cardinal Richelieu? What was he trying to do? Cardinal Richelieu believed in absolutism. He believed that the king was the source of all government, the source of all law, that the king answered to no one but God. And he saw himself, as Cardinal Richelieu, he saw himself as the servant of the king. It was his job to give honor and glory to the House of Bourbon. He saw himself as the servant of that dynasty. So now, even when Louis XIII grew up and became a man, he still allowed Cardinal Richelieu to run the government. So Louis XIII was the king, but largely the job of running the government was in the hands of Cardinal Richelieu. So how did Cardinal Richelieu establish absolutism? He was very tricky about it. What he did was, first of all, he didn't upset the cart by trying to get rid of these aristocrats. He allowed the aristocrats to keep all their privileges. They didn't have to pay taxes. They were guaranteed these jobs in the government. But what he did was that he would slowly but surely, he created new government positions, and he would transfer power from these like hereditary office holders to these new officials that he was creating, these new appointees. And he always, when he got these appointees, he always tended to recruit them from the ranks of the middle class. Let's say there were commoners who had gotten a good education and were well educated and very ambitious. He would see them as preferable because they had talent and ability, and he would appoint them to these new positions and give them political power. And so basically the aristocrats were left in a position where they still had all these nice titles and offices, but they didn't have any real power. The real power is in the hands of these newly created officials who were picked on the basis of loyalty and talent and ability. So in this way, over time, Cardinal Richelieu was able to create a very effective bureaucracy that did his bidding and followed his orders. Now, he also began to build up his armies and to use the tax revenues to build up a strong standing army. Now, when he felt that the government was strong enough and that he had a strong enough government, he announced that all existing fortifications and castles and private armies were now banned. He wanted the kings to have a monopoly on force. He wanted the king's government to control all fortifications and all military outposts. So basically all private armies were banned and castles were banned. Now, many of the aristocrats accepted this because they were allowed to not pay taxes, and they got to keep their traditional offices that gave them honors and titles. So some aristocrats were like, oh, well, whatever. And they accepted this. Plus, the king had an army at his disposal, so if you tried to go against the king, he would send his forces against you. One aristocrat named Henry de Montmorency, he was from Toulouse in the south of France. He was related to the royal family, and he didn't think this was acceptable at all. So when he tried to start a revolt, Richelieu sent the royal forces in, and they took care of the guy. And they crushed his uprising. And that sent a message to everybody else: don't mess with the king. No more private armies, no more private castles, none of that. And in fact, he also forced the Huguenot towns that had fortifications. He forced these towns to dismantle their fortifications. And when they resisted, he crushed them. So he established a strong, powerful state with an effective bureaucracy. Now, another goal of Cardinal Richelieu, besides establishing a strong state with a strong bureaucracy, he wanted to establish the Bourbon family as the most powerful family in all of Europe. So that meant that put the Bourbons and the France at a collision course with the Habsburgs. And much of the policies of France were geared toward whatever we have to do to weaken the Habsburgs, we're going to do it. Just to give you an example. You're going to be reading about the 30 Years' War. In 1635, the 30 Years' War had reached a critical juncture where the Habsburgs, the Spanish Habsburgs in alliance with the Austrian Habsburgs, were at a point that they were going to win the 30 Years' War in Germany. And a victory for the Habsburgs would have elevated the power and authority of the Habsburg Empire, would have maybe made the Holy Roman Empire into a real empire under Habsburg control. And Cardinal Richelieu, that was unacceptable. He could not have a powerful Habsburg family. So even though he was Catholic, he was a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church, no less, Catholic France allied itself with the Protestants in Germany against the Catholic Habsburgs. So he was willing to ally Catholic France with Protestant Germany to defeat a Catholic Habsburg state. And it turned out to be a critical point in the war. It helped the Protestant side to win the war if you can call a victory in the 30 Years' War. It was a terrible war, but anyway. So this was a big blow to the Habsburgs to lose the 30 Years' War. By the Peace of Westphalia, that basically was really a blow to efforts by the Austrian Habsburgs to establish any kind of authority within Germany. Now, by this time, though, by 1648, Richelieu was already dead, but his policies continued after his death. And eventually, even when the war against the Austrian Habsburgs was over in 1648, the war against the Spanish Habsburgs continued until the Habsburgs of Spain sued for peace in 1660 with the Peace of Pyrenees. So by 1660, the policy of Richelieu that he had started back in the 1630s had reached its completion point and success, where after 1660, the Bourbons had been elevated, and the Habsburgs, while still powerful, were the number 2 dynasty in Europe. Now, you might ask, how was Richelieu able to continue his policies beyond the grave? Well, he found a way to do it. You see, well, let me go to the next slide here. He found a man to be his successor. His name was Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin wasn't even French. He was Italian. He had arrived in France as a young man as the ambassador from the Pope. And Cardinal Richelieu liked this young Italian guy. I thought he was a pretty smart guy. Saw him mentored him, became his patron. And what happened is when Richelieu died in 1642, there was already a guy to take charge, Mazarin. So Mazarin had been tutored by Richelieu, and he took on the job as being the chief minister in 1642. Now, the very next year, in 1643, Louis XIII died. Now, when Louis XIII died in 1643, his boy, his oldest boy, little Louis, was just 5 years old. Louis XIV was just 5 years old. And so that created a situation where the mother of Louis the 14th was the regent. Her name was Anne of Austria. Now, she was Habsburg. Actually, she's called Anne of Austria because she grew up in Austria, but she was actually a Spanish Habsburg. But she was the regent. So you had a situation in France again where you had a foreign woman serving as regent in France. And but you had, at this time, you had Cardinal Mazarin there in support of the Queen, and they became a team. In fact, this is even though Cardinal Mazarin was a priest and supposed to be celibate, he in fact was for all intents and purposes, the husband of Anne of Austria. So even though he was a priest and a cardinal, basically they had a husband-wife relationship. So in a sense, Mazarin became the dad, the adopted, not the adopted father, but yeah, the stepdad basically of Louis XIV. And Cardinal Mazarin would train his son, his adopted son, Louis XIV. So the policies that Richelieu started continued by Mazarin, and then and that's where the policies that Louis XIV were raised on. Now things got a little crazy for Anne of Austria and Mazarin. In 1648, you had a big uprising. In 1648, for example, in Paris, because there was a bad harvest and there were food shortages, and the people of Paris were getting really fed up with these heavy taxes. You know, the war in the 30 Years' War, which France was involved in, was very costly, and taxes had been raised, and the people of Paris got tired of the heavy taxes and the absence of food and the malnutrition, and there was a massive uprising. It's called the Fronde. Fronde means uprising. So the streets of Paris were in turmoil, rocks were being thrown, riots in the streets. At the same time, you had this institution in Paris called the Parliament of Paris. Now, it wasn't really a parliament. It was called a parliament because it was a council. But basically what it was hereditary office holders formed a council that kind of oversaw the French bureaucracy. Now, you've got to remember that beginning with Richelieu and continuing under Mazarin, traditional office holders had seen their powers stripped and given to new political offices. And so by 1648, many of the traditional office holders, these hereditary office holders, were wise to the fact that their powers and influence were being slowly stripped away. So in 1648, seeing that there was this uprising in Paris and that the king was in a weak position, he was like just a boy and there was a foreigner as a regent, the Parliament of Paris demanded more power. They said, we want to make it a law that no government positions can be appointed without our approval. They wanted to create some kind of limit on the power of the king. Not very different than what the English Parliament was trying to do in England. But you see, this is at the same time that this happened, the landowning aristocrats, remember they had been forced to give up their armies. They resurrected their old armies, kind of got their old buddies back together, get their old armies, their old knights, and they marched on Paris too. So you had this complete chaos in France with these mercenary armies of aristocrats roaming the countryside. You had street battles in the streets of Paris with angry peasants and angry workers demanding no more taxes. And then you had the Parliament of Paris demanding that they be given more power from the king. So how did Anne and Mazarin deal with it? They decided just to skip out of town. They said, let's just not even address this. We're just going to go into hiding and just see what happens. So they refused to make any concessions to anybody. And Mazarin and Anne and little Louis XIV, they went into hiding. And what happened is that things got so chaotic that there was this general, when it was all said and done, all the Frenchmen could agree on this. They said, none of this is working. We need a strong king to establish order. We can't live with all this chaos. We need a strong, powerful king who's going to take charge and run the government and reestablish order and peace. So by 1652, all of a sudden, Mazarin and Louis XIV and Queen Anne, they come back to Paris, and everybody's cheering crowds. Everybody's like, yes, we can't handle liberty. We need to have a strong government to tell us what to do. We can't handle it, you know. And that was the feeling that everybody had. So Mazarin came to full power, and the Parliament of Paris they were forgotten, and everything continued as it had been before. Now, Louis XIV here's his picture here, he never forgot that feeling of having to run. You know, when he was a young man, he was running for his life. He was in hiding, and he never forgot that. So he grew up with this attitude that most people, the common people, really stink, you know. You heard that saying about the king when somebody said, the peasants are revolting, the peasants are revolting. The king said, yeah, they stink, you know, they need a bath, they're revolting, you know. Ha, 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 boom, psh. But anyway, but that was kind of the attitude of Louis XIV. He didn't trust the common people. And one of the first things he did when he became king was he moved his government out of Paris. He built this fantastic palace at Versailles. It was Versailles became the most beautiful, most elaborate palace in all of Europe. He wanted the palace to be a showplace. And he invited all the aristocrats of France to build their townhomes, to build in and around Versailles. Now, there was a reason behind that. He wanted the aristocrats to build their homes in Versailles so that they could be impressed by his power and his vast wealth and his luxury. He wanted to intimidate the aristocracy. And aristocrats, they wanted to be a part of Louis XIV. He was so considered to be so wonderful, so great, so powerful, that they wanted to be a part of his court. So during the reign of Louis XIV, the great aristocrats, they weren't interested in advancing their own personal interests as much as they wanted to be part of Louis XIV's court. They wanted to bask in his glory. And they knew that if they crossed him, they would be in trouble because he had this vast standing army that he was building. He realized, like Richelieu, that without a strong, powerful army, your government's going to be weak. So he had a strong army, standing army. He created the biggest, strongest standing army in all of Europe. By the middle of the 17th century, his army numbered about 250,000 men. It was the biggest standing army in all of Europe. And aristocrats knew they had a big standing army, and they figured, well, we can bask in his glory and not cross him. That would probably be the best choice for us. So he created Versailles as a showplace of his king. And one of the things he did at Versailles was that it had a theme. The theme was the sun. Because think about this. There's only one sun in the sky, right? One king, one sun. The sun is the source of all light. The king is the source of all light. So everywhere you went, there was sun iconography everywhere. You know, the god Apollo, sun imagery everywhere. Because he was the king. He was the Lord of light, bringing light and love and luxury and law to all the throngs. You know, and all the aristocrats they all basked in it. And there were parties, and there were fireworks shows, and there was ballet, and I mean there was concerts. I mean, it was just one party after another. But there was a purpose behind it. It wasn't just about luxury. It was about showing off the power and the greatness of Louis XIV. Now, he also continued the policies of his predecessors in building a strong bureaucracy. In fact, he created a whole new system called intendants. Now, intendants were, you know, his thinking was, if you're going to have a big, powerful bureaucracy, you need to have people to watch the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy has to be accountable. So he had these positions called intendants, who were appointed by the king, whose job was to make sure that all the bureaucrats were doing their jobs and were doing what's right. He also created the first police force. Now, he created a police force for all the cities and towns to keep the peace, to keep order in the towns, but he also used the police to investigate charges of corruption and inefficiency by the bureaucracy. So he created a police force also to keep watch on the people of France, to make sure that to maintain law and order, but also to establish a way of keeping an eye on the bureaucracy. Now, when he made appointments to his police and when he made appointments to be intendants, he appointed people on the basis of talent and ability, and a lot of them were from the middle class in origin, people who were not aristocrats, but were from common origins, who had got a good education, were ambitious, and were hardworking and very loyal to the king. Now, he was also a big believer in advancing trade. He was very much a secular monarch in the sense that, you know, he knew that he was a big believer in the Catholic Church and everything, but he also believed in that the government had a job to create a strong economy and promote economic interest. And his right-hand man was a man by the name of Jean Colbert, like the Colbert Report. Now, Jean Colbert was another financial genius. And he came up with this idea that nobody had thought of before. He said, okay, let's create a thing called a budget. Let's estimate how much money we can collect in taxes every year, and then use that estimate to determine our priorities, what we're going to pay for. Did you know that before Jean Colbert, nobody had a budget? But now we take that for granted. The governments have to have a budget. But it was Louis XIV was a trendsetter in having a budget. He also believed that government could create and establish a strong economy. For example, he was a big believer in an economic theory called mercantilism. Mercantilism was the belief that a government's wealth was measured by its gold reserves. The more gold they had, the stronger the government. And so the idea was to initiate economic policies. Yes?
The gold part, isn't that the same thing that our country's dollar is based on, like our gold value?
Our dollar is not based on gold. It used to be
Huh.
until 1971.
So what's our dollar based on?
Nothing.
Okay.
Well, we used to have a gold-based system till, well, actually, we effectively went off it during the Great Depression in the 1930s, but we officially went off the gold standard in 1971. We have a bunch of gold in Fort Knox, but it just sits there. Anyway, but the idea was to collect gold, and under mercantilism, one way you assembled gold was through putting in customs duties. The idea would be that you don't want people buying goods from other countries. You want people to buy goods produced in your own country. So you put taxes on foreign imports so that those foreign imports, it's called a tariff, so that those foreign imports will be more expensive and people will buy locally made goods, right? So like one of the things he realized was that too many wealthy French people were buying Chinese porcelain, right? That means that gold was leaving the country and going to China, or going to people bringing the gold in from China. So he said, let's have porcelain factories right here in France, and let's have people produce porcelain right here. So that's when he actually gave support to merchants to build porcelain factories to mass produce porcelain goods right in France so that people wouldn't have to pay and send gold out of the country by buying porcelain from China. He was a big supporter, and one of the things he did was he used the intendants to promote French products. Like he would send these intendants to these porcelain factories and say, what I want you to do is say that our porcelain is the best porcelain in the world, and then we're going to advertise it. So he would say that the intendants would go to these factories and say, based on our study of these factories, the French porcelain is the best porcelain in the world, stamped and approved by the government of France. And that he used that as a marketing tool. And then so that he could export French porcelain, so people would buy French porcelain, not Chinese porcelain. So he wanted to promote French export, because when a country exports goods, that means the gold's coming back into the country. The whole idea behind mercantilism is to hoard gold, because the more gold you have, the more money you have, the more money you have, the more bigger armies you can build, voila. And that's what Louis XIV wanted to do. He geared lots of his economic policies toward building a strong state so he could build a big, strong, powerful army. We'll get to that in a minute. Another goal of mercantilism is to establish colonies. Why? Because you establish colonies, the colonies can provide you with goods so you don't have to buy them from foreign merchants. So he was a big believer in establishing colonies. In fact, a number of cities that are in the United States today were founded as French colonies. Mobile, Alabama, Biloxi, Mississippi. Originally, the land of Louisiana stretched all the Mississippi Valley from the Great Lakes all the way down, was claimed by France. It became known as Louisiana, originally referred to all the lands watered by the mighty Mississippi River. And he encouraged the colonization of the New World in French Quebec and in Louisiana. Now, why? Because that way you could get these foreign goods. Like Louisiana became a major source of furs, because furs were in demand in Europe. And so if Frenchmen are buying their furs from French fur providers, they're not sending their gold somewhere else, right? They established colonies in the Caribbean to produce sugar, French Caribbean, because they wanted French sugar. They wanted French colonies producing sugar in the Caribbean to provide sugar for Frenchmen living in France. That way, Frenchmen aren't buying sugar from foreign merchants, or they're keeping the gold within the country. So his purpose behind establishing colonies was to promote mercantilism and to provide a French source of French exotic goods like furs and sugar. So we see under Louis XIV a big emphasis on colonization. The French established colonies and outposts in India, in the Caribbean, and in the New World, in North America, during the reign of Louis XIV. All right. Now, the thing about Louis XIV was that everything was about building a big, huge army and establishing France as the mightiest country in Europe. In many ways, he was a French patriot. But he equated the glory of France with his own dynasty. So basically, in his view, glory to his family, glory to the Bourbon dynasty, equated glory to the French people. He believed what was good for him was good for France. So that when he was doing all this work, he would say to himself, this isn't just about me. This is about bringing glory to the French people. My glory is the glory of France. That's how you think. He's a famous quote of his. He said, I am the state. When people asked him about France, he said, I am the state. I am France. That was his view. So he wanted to build an army because the thing he wanted to do was to continue to hammer at the Habsburgs, weaken the Habsburgs, and establish France as the dominant military force in all of Europe. So what you see happening is Louis XIV fought a whole series of wars that influenced the whole history of Europe in the 17th century. And eventually he found himself facing a coalition of European powers who were trying to maintain a balance of power and trying to keep Louis XIV from being too powerful. All right. Well, why don't we take a little break here? We've got for quite a while. We'll take a break, and then we'll finish up Louis XIV. So about 3 or 4 minutes.
Go ahead and check in.
I'm gonna take a roll. All right. Now Louis XIV, he wanted to weaken the Habsburgs, but he also had this idea that France had certain natural boundaries. So he believed that the mountains and the sea and the Rhine River represented the natural boundaries of France. And so part of his campaigns, or many of his wars were designed on establishing France's natural boundaries. Now, it so happened that the Habsburg family, the Spanish Habsburgs, still claimed territories along the Rhine River, and he believed that these lands belonged to him because he wanted to extend France's borders. He also believed that all of the Spanish Netherlands were rightfully his because the Walloons who lived there spoke French, and he was the king of all Frenchmen. So in his view, the Spanish Netherlands ought to belong to France, not to the Spanish Habsburgs. Now, so a lot of his wars were directed against the Spanish Habsburgs because that was part of his idea of expanding France's borders to the Rhine River. Now, the thing about Louis XIV was that he was a man who believed very strongly in law and order. So he didn't like the idea of being an aggressor. He didn't want to be the bad guy. In other words, he believed that all of his wars had to be based on some kind of legal precedent. Now, it so happened that he found one. If you look hard enough, you can find a legal precedent for anything. Now, his wife was a Habsburg. Her name was Maria Theresa. This is a different Maria Theresa than you were going to study in the 18th century in Austria. But Maria Theresa of Spain was the eldest daughter of Philip IV of Spain. Now, in 1667, the throne passed to a new king of Spain. His name was Charles II. Now, Charles II of Spain was the result of a second marriage. Now, Louis XIV was claiming, based on what he called the law of devolution, that since Maria Theresa, his wife, was the eldest daughter of a first marriage, she was entitled to some land. Not the throne of Spain, but entitled to land. So he believed that he was entitled to certain lands along the Rhine River because by virtue of his marriage to Maria Theresa of Spain. So he went to war against Spain to claim these lands. And it's called the War of Devolutions, after the law of devolution that Louis XIV claimed. And the war went very well for Louis XIV. The Spanish Habsburgs were kind of overwhelmed at the time. He was able to win some victories and claim some territories. So this first entree into war was a success. Now, it wasn't long before he got involved in a new war. Now, his new war was targeted the Dutch. The Dutch Netherlands. Remember, the Dutch Netherlands, after 1648, was independent, formally recognized as independent by Spain, the United Provinces of the Dutch. And the reason why Louis XIV did not like the Dutch is because they were making him look bad. The Dutch were just going through a great period of economic activity. The United Provinces were a group of provinces. Probably the most famous of these provinces was Holland. A lot of times, Holland and the Dutch are equated with one another, but the United Provinces actually included more than just Holland. There was the Frisia, there were a bunch of different, Utrecht, there was a bunch of different provinces, but Holland by far was the wealthiest provinces because it had the great cities of Rotterdam and Amsterdam. And at this particular time, in the middle of the 17th century, the leading aristocrat, the leading merchants, not aristocrats, but the great merchant families of Holland kind of dominated the Estates General and dominated politics more so than the House of Orange and the Stadtholder. In fact, the most powerful man in the Netherlands in the middle of the 17th century was a man from Holland by the name of John de Witt, who was the chief executive of the Holland Estates, the Councillor Pensionaire, was his official title. Now, the Dutch had a very expansive trading empire. You know, the Dutch were the first to settle in New York. Before it was New York City, it was actually New Amsterdam. The Dutch had colonies in the New World. They had established colonies in the Caribbean. They tried to take Brazil from the Portuguese and seize it for themselves. They established colonies in the Caribbean. They established colonies in Indonesia. So they had colonies extending all the way into what is today Java and the islands of Indonesia. So they had a vast, expansive trading empire. And Dutch companies, the Dutch almost invented the idea of stocks and investment companies along with the English and the Italians. They the Dutch companies had vast networks of trading ships, and the Dutch were the first to establish the idea of a stock exchange. The first stock exchange in the world was located in Amsterdam, where you could go to the Amsterdam Stock Exchange and buy and sell stock, and all these Dutch companies that had trading ties with the entire world. So in many ways, in terms of finance and trade, the Dutch were on the cutting edge in the middle of the 17th century. They also were mercantilists, so they put heavy taxes on French goods, and that really bothered Louis XIV. He was bothered that the Dutch were so magnificent and were putting taxes on French exports. This is the high point of French culture. I mean, of Dutch culture. Rembrandt lived at this time. There's a famous Night Watch painting by Rembrandt. It was the time of the great Dutch scientists. And the Dutch were really on the cutting edge at this point. They were sometimes called the golden age of the Dutch. And Louis XIV was the type of guy that he didn't like other people having golden ages. The only country that mattered was France. Because he was the king of France. So he decided to go to war against the Dutch, and it was called the Dutch War. I thought that's funny, because historians are very obvious, Dutch War, early modern era Dutch War. That was what they called it. And so he brought his armies against the Dutch, and the Dutch, this is when William of Orange, who was just a young man at the time, kind of emerged as a great hero among the Dutch, because he was of the House of Orange, and he was asked to take command of the armies of the Dutch facing the French. And the Dutch were so independent-minded that rather than be defeated by the much larger forces of Louis XIV, they would destroy their own dams, their dikes, and flood their own land rather than give in to the French. So as the French armies would advance, the Dutch would destroy their dams, flooding their fields and destroying their fields, so that the floodwaters would kill the French and isolate the French. So the Dutch were willing to destroy their own livelihood to ensure their independence. And the Dutch War was very destructive on both sides. Lots of lives were lost by the French and the Dutch. Some people would say that the Dutch War destroyed the Dutch Golden Age because there was so much economic damage. Remember, those fields were all very fertile. Those were their source of their grain and their farm life, their cattle and all that, and it was all destroyed. Not all of it, but much of it destroyed. So it took a heavy blow on the Dutch economy. And it was also a heavy blow on the French economy because Louis XIV had to keep on raising taxes to have the money to keep on fighting this war. Now, it finally ended in 1678, and basically it resolved nothing. So it was 6 years of war that was very costly but resolved nothing. Now, but Louis XIV was still intent on expansion. Now, he came up with this idea of expansion. He said, you know what? I'm going to go through all the ancient records, and I'm going to find out if there was ever a land along the Rhine River that ever swore allegiance to the King of France. And I'm going to say that if they did at some point, then as a vassal, I'm going to say that that land now belongs to France. Now, there was a very important duchy along the Rhine River called the Rhine-Palatinate. Very wealthy. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was very wealthy, had lots of cities on it, lots of wealth, but it was on the Rhine River. Now, Louis XIV went back through the ancient records, and he discovered that at some point, hundreds of years ago, the Duke of that region had sworn allegiance to the King of France. So he said, aha, that land belongs to France. Even though it happened hundreds of years ago, it doesn't matter. So in 1688, he sent his forces into the Dutch Palatinate. Not the Dutch, but the Rhine Palatinate in 1688. Now, this freaked out the Dutch. Why? Because when the French occupied this region, what that meant was that gave them, if you look at a map of Germany and the Netherlands and all that, that would give the French an immediate point of attack to direct their forces against the Netherlands. So the occupation of the Rhine Palatinate by French troops was seen as a direct threat by William of Orange and the Dutch. So William of Orange, being the nemesis of Louis XIV, he put together a league. By this time, a lot of the other countries in Europe were realizing that Louis XIV was getting too big for his britches. So he put together an alliance. He went to the former enemies of the Dutch, the Spanish Habsburgs, and said, "Hey, join us. The enemy of your enemy is your friend." So the Dutch and the Spanish Habsburgs formed an alliance. He went to the Austrian Habsburg and said, look, do you want the Holy Roman Empire broken up? Are we going to allow this to happen? We need to unite. So William of Orange built an alliance called the League of Augsburg. And remember in 1688, something else happened. What did William of Orange do in 1688 as well? Anybody remember? We just discussed it. 1688, William of Orange, William and Mary, they did what? Glorious revolution. Remember, he took the throne of England. By taking the throne of England, he brought Great Britain into the alliance. You see, Louis XIV actually had given he was related by blood to the Stuart family. They were cousins. And he'd actually given money and subsidies to both Charles II and James II to keep the peace and to keep Great Britain out of European affairs. In fact, the Dutch and the British actually went to war in 1664. The British and the Dutch went to war for economic reasons, and that was the war in which the British seized New Amsterdam and took over, and that's how the New Netherlands became New York. But so up to this point, the British had been kind of allies of Louis XIV and stayed out of the wars. But by William of Orange accepting the throne of England, he brought England into this grand alliance, this League of Augsburg, to fight against Louis XIV. And so you have this war, the League of Augsburg, that lasted from 1688 to 1697. And it finally ended when Louis XIV decided to withdraw his forces from the Rhine-Palatinate. So basically, the League of Augsburg, the result of that war was it did finally force Louis XIV to withdraw, retire from his claims to the Rhine-Palatinate. But wait, there's more. Something else happened. In 1700, Charles II, the King of Spain, died. Now, Charles II was, let's put it nicely, he was mentally ill. He was crazy. He never had children. Probably couldn't have children. Now, it turned out that when he died, when the King of Spain died, the Habsburg King of Spain died, the closest relative to him was his half-sister's grandson. His half-sister's grandson was Philip of Anjou. Now, Philip of Anjou was not only the grandson of Maria Theresa of Spain, she was also the grandson of Louis XIV. So, big picture, Louis XIV is saying, my grandson will be the King of Spain and control all of the New World, the Latin world, all the New World will belong to my grandson. So the way it would work, you'd have one grandson, King of France, a Bourbon, and you have another grandson, King of Spain. And he was thinking, Bourbons are going to dominate Europe, yeah, woohoo! He was really happy. He was like, this is great, this is awesome. But everybody else was like, oh my gosh, we can't have this. We can't have a Bourbon King of France and a Bourbon King of Spain. You know, I mean, the Bourbons will like have complete domination of all of Europe. So the man who took the lead in fighting this was who? Who was the enemy of Louis XIV?
William of Orange.
William of Orange. He was the King of England now. He said, we're not going to let this happen, baby. So he had a plan. The plan was an alternative. Turned out that the Habsburg emperor had two sons, Joseph and Charles Charles was the younger son. So the alternative plan was to maintain the status quo. So you continue to have a Habsburg in Austria, and then Charles of Habsburg would go over and become the new king of Spain. So that was the alternative. So you have that system. Well, anyway, so the enemies of Louis XIV formed a grand alliance led by England and led by William of Orange initially. And became known as the War of Spanish Succession from 1702 to 1714. Now, Louis XIV decided to try to win this war quickly and easily by knocking out the Habsburgs. So in 1704, early on in the war, he built up this massive army, and he crossed from France, he went across southern Germany, and he targeted Vienna, the capital of the Habsburgs, in Austria. And outside of Vienna, the Habsburg armies were commanded by a man by the name of Eugene of Savoy. Now, I have to tell the story because I love the story. Eugene of Savoy was from the Savoy, which is this little principality between Spain and France and Italy. And the story is that when he was a young man, he went to the court of Louis XIV and said, I want to serve you, Louis XIV. and Eugene of Savoy was kind of ugly and short. And Louis XIV all laughed and said, "You're too ugly and short to serve me. Get out of my sight. You sicken me." And Eugene of Savoy was like, "Well, to hell with you. I'm going to go fight for the Habsburgs." So he went and he served the Habsburgs, and he was like the right-hand man of the Habsburgs. So he was commanding the Habsburg forces against the armies of Louis XIV. Now, by this time, the British had sent their greatest commander, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. And so you have the Duke of Marlborough and Eugene of Savoy, and a great battle was fought outside of Vienna, the Battle of Blenheim. And it was an important battle because it was Louis XIV was putting everything into this offensive, and he came up short. Eugene of Savoy and John Churchill were able to drive him back and win the day, and that was the end of that. Now, this war dragged on for years, even though Louis XIV's armies had been spent, but it dragged on for years. Now, eventually what happened is that Charles's older brother, Joseph, died without heir. So Charles of Habsburg became Holy Roman Emperor. And once that happened, in the middle of this war, a lot of people were thinking, do we really want the same guy to be Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain? So the result was that the alliance against Louis XIV kind of fell apart. And eventually peace was secured with the Peace of Utrecht in 1714. Now, peace treaties tend to be compromises, and this is what exactly happened with this peace treaty. What happened is that Philip of Anjou was recognized as the new king of Spain. In fact, the current king of Spain is a direct descendant of Philip of Anjou, because the Bourbon dynasty is still the rulers of Spain, even though they're constitutional monarchs now. But nonetheless, so Philip of Anjou became the king of Spain. But they decided to strip Spain of its European territory. So the Spanish Netherlands was given to the Austrian Habsburgs. So the Spanish Netherlands now became the Austrian Netherlands and belonged to the House of Habsburg. And Spain's lands in Italy, like Naples and Sicily and Milan, were transferred to the Habsburg family and the House of Savoy. The House of Savoy was given Sicily, and Naples and Milan were given to the Austrian Habsburg. So, but Philip of Anjou continued to hold on to the New World. That empire was preserved to Spain. So that was the compromise that was reached. But the thing about Louis XIV was that when he left the throne, he left France in a very weakened condition. You know, he'd had to raise taxes considerably, and many historians have pointed out that France was bled dry by these wars. So he left a France dramatically weakened in manpower through all the wars. He left a France that was heavily in debt, and at the same time had a situation where they had to raise taxes. And these taxes, the thing about taxes is they never go away. They might cut taxes on occasion, but they never do. Taxes always, the trend for taxes, once you have taxes, they always go up. They never go down. They might go down here and there, if there's as an aberration. But taxes and bureaucracies are like I said earlier, are the closest things to immortality in this world. They never die. So once taxes were raised to these very high levels by Louis XIV, future generations were burdened by these taxes. And you also had a system where the bureaucracy did not have to pay taxes. So you had a system where the bureaucracy, who were some of the wealthiest people, paid no taxes. The aristocrats paid no taxes. The church paid no taxes. The people who were paying all the taxes were the commoners and the peasants, and they were given burdened with the heavy taxes and heavy debts. And so Louis XIV, his legacy for France was that he left France in a much weakened condition. If you look at the history of France in the 18th century, France was not nearly the main powerful player that it was during the time of Louis XIV. All right. Now, before we have a couple minutes, I wanted to cover one more thing. All right. Real quick. What I wanted to talk about was why Spain was such a mess. Because you read about Latin America. I just wanted to cover real quickly a couple things about Spain before we have to leave. Think about Spain. One reason why Spain which had been so powerful in the 16th century, in the 17th century, kind of fell apart was, well, a lot of it had to do with the fact that Philip II had created a system where so much power was in the hands of the king. But what do you do when you have kings who aren't of the caliber of Philip II? The problem with Philip II was that his descendants went from mediocre to mentally ill. Philip III, Philip IV, Charles II were over time became, each generation was more corrupt, not corrupt, but just mediocre. I mean, in fact, Charles II, like I said, was mentally ill, had no children. Now, having weak and mediocre kings at the top meant that there was nobody watching this door. So the bureaucracy that Philip II had created was kind of left to its own devices. It wasn't accountable to anybody. Now, the ministers who held power in this bureaucracy, who ran Spain because the kings were incompetent, they were only interested in promoting their own wealth, their own families. And they had a practice called selling offices. They would actually sell offices in the government to the highest bidders. And they created new offices, new government positions, so they could sell them to the highest bidder. So the Spanish bureaucracy continued to grow and grow and grow, and many of the positions in it were kind of useless positions. They existed for the sake of themselves. They did nothing. So you had all these Spanish aristocrats holding these government jobs that did nothing, and they all got a government check for doing a job for doing nothing. And they all got tax exemption. So Spain had a very corrupt bureaucracy, full of corruption, that was very weak and ineffective and very bulky and expensive. And the tax burden continued to fall on the peasants. Now, they had all this gold and silver coming in from the New World. It mainly continued to go to foreign bankers or into the pockets of Spanish aristocrats and bureaucrats. So it didn't actually help the government as much as it helped members of the bureaucracy who were pocketing a lot of the gold and silver for their own family's use. Another reason why Spain continued to weaken was because there was a constant flow of its best and brightest to the New World. You know, Latin America was a place of opportunity. So it's estimated that many Spanish commoners, especially, who had no future in Spain, went to the New World, because in Latin America, in the New World, if you were a Spaniard, if you were of European blood, you already had a higher status than the indigenous peoples, or those of mixed blood, you know, the people of African and Native American blood. So you could go from being a nobody in Spain to being a somebody in the New World. So some of the best and the brightest from the New World, estimated like 4,000 a year, were moving to Latin America, to Cuba, to Puerto Rico, to Mexico, to Peru, to start new lives, and they could get government jobs there. And the thing about the New World was that you could, in the New World, the government...
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
Thank you. So Latin America, really, this was a really great time for Latin America, because while Spain was declining, you had all these people coming and starting new businesses and new colonists coming in. And because the Spanish government was so corrupt, basically the local Creoles, the Creoles being people of European blood who were born and raised in the New World, these Creoles had the run of the store. So in Mexico and in Peru, you know, New Granada is what it's called now, Peru, or in Mexico, New Spain, the government was pretty much self-autonomous and self-governing. Not by vision of the King of Spain, but because the government was so weak, the areas of Spain and of the New World were pretty much autonomous. And this was a great time in the history of this area. And there continued to be expansion at this time. Spanish settlers expanded into Chile, where they fought the Mapuche against the natives there. They also advanced into Argentina. So Spanish control expanded. But one thing, so that was going on. I got to get out of here because it's going to turn off in a second. But so that was, but the Spanish declined while France emerged as a great power in the 17th century. All right, I'll see you all on Tuesday. We're going to pick it up with the Habsburgs after the 30 Years' War. So read about the 30 Years' War on Thursday. Do discussion 3.
8 points.
Saturday.
That's not happening.
That's the cool that's first it's for break time.
Where are you going to be at? Oh.
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, I almost got it. I got something.
Did you say you're not going to be here next Thursday?
This is next Thursday.
Discussion number 3.